Hello, my name is Lydia Radin. I'm a federal whistleblower and a tenant advocate. And I am going to give you one example right now of a case that I'm involved in where a criminal scheme is being executed involving the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. This is in Flatbush, Brooklyn, Judge Lydia C. Lay, and a crooked doctor. So I'm going to give one example of a willful overcharge. A little old lady paid her rent in full in February of 2010. These are some details I'm going to go through and I'm going to set it up. Here's what you need to know. I got about half an hour of an audio tape that shows how in Flatbush, Brooklyn, right now, a crooked doctor working in a tag team with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, Anthony Borowski, works in a tag team with Sherry Dampier at Adult Protective Services. When I came to live in Brooklyn, there's a little old lady, a Jehovah's Witness, who gave me sanctuary. And what we discovered was that her landlord had deceived her into overpaying her rent. And instead of settling this amiably, the landlord sicked Adult Protective Services on this little old lady. Now they're running, the Adult Protective Services sent a psychiatrist down, found her competent, but that didn't serve the landlord's interests. So now, as we're in court fighting this overcharge and trying to get justice for this little old lady, the dishonest crooked doctor, the crooked psychiatrist, is changing his story. And they want to label this little old lady incompetent so that Adult Protective Services can take her case, and then the landlord can access a one-time cash emergency grant for so-called back rent. There is no back rent. In fact, there's an overcharge. And this is one example of a willful overcharge. The tenant, I'm going to get into these details, the tenant paid February 2010 rent in full. About a year later, the dishonest landlord got a retroactive tax credit too. So in one hand, he's holding full payment for rent, and then about a year later, he gets an additional payment of a tax credit retroactively. So he's got an overcharge here. Instead of giving the tenant involved her money back, she is withholding rent until she spends down the overcharge. And what we got here is a criminal scheme involving a crooked doctor, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Action Center, notably paralegal Anthony Borowski, and Judge Lydia C. Lay. So I'm going to set this up for about 5 minutes, and then you're going to listen to prima facie evidence. This is a tape-recorded conversation for about half an hour where I'm talking to the Adult Protective Services, and basically. You know that my name is Lydia Radin. I'm a federal whistleblower. I'm a tenant advocate. I am staying temporarily in Brooklyn while I litigate to get my rent-stabilized apartment in Washington Heights back, because I've got a crooked judge named Judge Brenda Spears in Manhattan Landlord-Tenant Court. And after I got out of Rikers Island, where I was illegally incarcerated, and illegally convicted, I tried to get my apartment back, and I've got a dishonest judge in Manhattan Landlord-Tenant Court named Brenda Spears, who fabricated, wholesale made up a illegal ruling that it was okay for my roommate to change the locks without a court order. That's an illegal lockout. So I had to get a pro bono attorney with a large nonprofit group to appeal that case. Now, while I'm being persecuted by a bunch of by a bunch of racist Zionists associated with my medical school, the Albert Einstein College of Medicine of Yeshiva University, a nice little old lady in Brooklyn who's a Jehovah's Witness, and she understands about people who are subjected to religious persecution, like I am being subjected to religious persecution, and she gave me a place to stay. And what we discovered was that her landlord was dishonest, Gilbert Polinsky, and he deceived her into overpaying. So instead of settling this amiably, the landlord has executed a criminal scheme. Now, I went down to Natasha Phillips, who is the bookkeeper for landlord Gilbert Polinsky, and I tried to get an accurate bill so that the little old lady who I'm staying with, Betty Povinetti, and I'm going to have her on my TV show next week so you can see her for yourself. Betty Povinetti, I tried to get an accurate bill for her, and in retaliation, the landlord's bookkeeper, Natasha Phillips, called Adult Protective Services and sicked a psychiatrist on this little old lady. Well, the psychiatrist came down to the apartment and found that Betty Povinetti was competent, but that wasn't good enough for the landlord because the landlord wants money. So now this crooked doctor, this dishonest psychiatrist, is changing his story to claim that this little old lady is now incompetent so that a criminal scheme can be executed. And the criminal scheme is to have Adult Protective Services take over this woman's case so the landlord can access a one-time cash emergency grant for so-called back rent. Well, there is no back rent. In fact, there's an overcharge. So, for example, in this video, I'm going to show you one incredibly easy to understand example of the landlord's willful overcharge. The tenant paid the February 2010 rent in full. About a year later, in March of 2011, the landlord got a retroactive tax credit too. That is an example, an irrefutable example of an overcharge, because in one hand, the landlord is holding payment in full, and in the other hand, he gets a tax credit. So that's an overcharge. And this is directed to Mr. Anthony Borowski over at the District Attorney's Action Center because he refuses to defend this little old lady. And this is also directed to Inspector Harmon over at the Department of Finance. So in February of 2010, Judge Lay, we're in landlord-tenant court now with Judge Lydia C. Lay. She touched this document. On this document, this is the invoice, the rent demand that the landlord sent for February 2010 rent. This is the receipt from the check that Betty Povinetti wrote. This is check number 135. I scanned it. We're going to look at it on our computer. That shows she paid this rent demand in full. And this is the landlord's ledger sheet where about a year later he gives this tenant a large credit of about $7,300. And this large credit was applied retroactively going back to this February rent payment. So by the end of March 2011, the landlord has received payment in full for the February 2010 rent, and he also got a retroactive tax credit. Isn't that great? That's an overcharge. Okay, it's not rocket science. Now, what this landlord had done was he had not credited this little old lady with her senior citizens tax discount. Now, apparently there's something called SCREE, which is an acronym for Senior Citizens Rent Increase Exemption. So basically, if you're a senior citizen, if you're a little old lady, little old man, living in a rent-stabilized apartment, and your rent goes up, the elected officials have given you a program where the government will give your landlord a tax credit. So even if your rent goes up, they get a tax credit so your rent is stabilized, okay? Now, I'm going to show you some details because what's happening now is a criminal scheme. This little old lady, and you're going to listen to about half an hour of an audio tape that shows the criminal scheme that's being executed. But I want to do a little show a few details first because these are going to Judge Linda C. Lay and her supervising judge and other individuals in law enforcement and in the community. Judge Lay has refused, for example, to recognize me as a friend of the court so I can help this little old lady. This is a little old lady who's 82 years old, and she's being bullied, and she has to stand up in front of this judge and argue her litigation points all by herself because she's being denied the assistance of a friend of the court. Instead, this judge is lying, and one of the criminal schemes that's being executed here is she's making false statements so they can create a false court record. And I can show you more examples of that. But Judge Lay lied and said she refused to recognize me because I had no standing. I didn't ask for standing. Standing is when you want to be a party to the action, as in a defendant or plaintiff. I didn't ask for that. I didn't ask to be a party to this case. I asked for friend of the court status, so when Betty Povanetti, a little 82-year-old Jehovah's Witness, says, the judge asks, can you please show me your canceled check receipts or your checkbook receipts for checks that you wrote to pay the landlord's rent demands, I can hand them to her so the judge can see this. Instead, this little old lady is being bamboozled. They've defamed her as incompetent. Apparently, they've defamed me as dangerous. And frankly, we're getting a little sick and tired of the persecution. So I'm going to give you one example of a willful overcharge. I'm going to show you those details now. And then we're going to listen to about 30-minute conversation with Adult Protective Services demonstrating that they have no plausible deniability. So let's go to our computer now so you can look at some of this. Okay, here we go. All right, so before I play the tape, because you're going to need to see this, I want you to get the overall gestalt. And the overall gestalt is what you're looking at here is a green invoice that the landlord has mailed to this tenant. This is on February 1st, 2010. And I want you to see right here, the landlord, Gilbert Polinsky, has written on this invoice. So he has no plausible deniability. This is his handwriting. We're going to look at it a little bit more in depth, but I just want you to get the overall gestalt. Mrs. Povanetti, please call me. I will pick up your rent. That's Polinsky. Gilbert Polinsky is her landlord. So you're going to notice a few things. Right here, the landlord writes on the invoices. So he has no plausible deniability. He knows what's going on. Ms. Povanetti, please call me. I will pick up your rent. Signed, Polinsky. Okay? This is a rent demand for February 1st, 2010, the current rent for February, and the rent demand is $666.69. That's the legal regulated rent. And nowhere do you see on this invoice the amount for the senior citizens discount. She should be getting a senior citizens discount here of about $223. So I have another tape-recorded conversation with Mr. Gilbert Polinsky where I say, you know, Mr. Polinsky, I've got a number of invoices where you're writing on the invoices. I really don't need your editorial comments. If you can take all the time and energy to write on these, and some of these you write these little nasty notes, why can't you just write on the invoice minus $223 and Betty will pay the rest, because she's not supposed to pay this whole $600 amount. She gets about a $200 senior citizens discount. She's only supposed to pay about $400. So you see the criminal scheme here, right? The landlord wants to get rid of this lady so that he can increase the rent from about $600, $700 to about $1,800. So he'll do anything to get rid of her, including labeling her as incompetent so he can drop kick her into a locked psychiatric ward or so he can drop kick her into a nursing home. Her son wants her drop kicked into a nursing home because her son may have stolen money from her bank account, and Mark Povanetti doesn't want any of that evidence to come to light. He's already threatened me. Betty Povanetti has already stated on the record, and this is confirmed by family and friends, that Mark Povanetti, her son, stole her jewelry. There are a lot of people here that would like to discredit Betty and me because we're managing towards the truth. So what you got here is the rent demand. You got the landlord writing on it. I called the landlord to try to settle this in a friendly manner, and I have an audio tape where he claims that this little old lady didn't pay the rent while she was in a locked psychiatric ward. She was not in a locked psychiatric ward. She didn't pay the rent because she paid an overcharge, and the landlord is not going to give her money back, so she's spending down the overcharge, and she has a right to do that. So let's look at this again. As you see, this is one example of an invoice. It does not have the accurate amount that she should pay, and the landlord is making a rent demand not only for the February 2010 rent, but he's also making a demands for more money, and here is the amount that he wants, $1,344.72. That includes the February rent demand, and this is the receipt from Mrs. Povinetti's checkbook where she paid this in full. And you see this check was written on or about February 18th, 2010. It was for the full amount. This is check number 135, and it's for, let me increase the magnification, and it's for $1,344.72. This is check 135, which was the rent demand for February. Okay, so she's paid this in full. Now, about a year later, because the landlord was not crediting her account with her senior citizens discount, he was forced to give her a great big credit. And this is happening in about March, the end of March 2011. So about a year later, not only in one hand does the landlord have all the money for the February rent, but he also gets a retroactive tax credit. So there's an overcharge because he got all the cash, now he gets a tax credit. Okay, so let's look at that. And by the way, all the people that you'll be listening to, hearing on this audio tape, they have all this evidence because I scanned it and sent it to them on email. It's not rocket science. So here's the landlord's rent ledger. This is the landlord's rent ledger, and I just want you to get the overall gestalt. These are the charges, right? And these are the payments column. And here we got charges, here we got payments, and this is March 1st, 2010, but if we scroll down, what we're going to see is right here, March 31st, 2011, the landlord is forced to give this tenant a huge credit. And this credit is applied retroactively back to all the credits she didn't get in the Senior Citizen Discount Program. And what I'm going to point out is, for example, this is March 2010, he gives her the credit. She gets a credit of about $223. He gives her the credit, he gives her the credit, he gives her the credit, he gives her the credit. This is in the payments column. And then for some reason, he takes it away. And you can see right here, right? This is the senior citizen exemption, the rent exemption, and right here, the senior citizen rent exemption for 5 months, 5 months times $223, he takes it away. Okay, he takes it away. So he gives her the credit and then he takes it away, and he claims that she wasn't eligible. And we'll get to that later. That's not a point we want to deal with now, but he gives her the credit, he gives her the credit, he gives her the credit, then he takes it away, he revokes it. Then there's a period of time where he doesn't give her the credit at all, okay? And then finally, all the paperwork is taken care of, and finally, down here by March 31st, 2011, he's forced to give her this big credit of about $7,300, and this $7,300 is applied retroactively for all these months that he didn't give it to her, which is about credits of about $2,000, and then he's forced to give her this credit back that he took away for about $1,117 for all these payments that he took away. And so that's about $2,000 of credit that he didn't give her. There's about $1,000 he took away. That's about $3,000. But this tax credit that he gave is not just for this going back for this amount of time, these 8 months for about $2,000 that he didn't credit her. And it's not just to restore these 5 months that he took away, but this tax credit is also applied retroactively to this payment here in February of 2010, right? Because this tax credit goes back. It's applied retroactively, not prospectively, which is going forward. That's the deceptive, those are the dishonest, deceptive misconstruing that the landlord's attorneys argued in court. So this big credit is applied to all the months that came before, where either the landlord didn't give her the credit or he gave her the credit here, as in these months, and then took it away. So this credit of about $7,300 goes back about 4 years, and it includes, it goes back about 2 years, and it includes this February 2010 rent demand, okay? So by March 31st, 2011, March 31st, 2011, the landlord is forced to give this tenant, all the paperwork has been taken care of. He says that he revoked the tax credit because the paperwork wasn't taken care of. But everyone agrees the paperwork was taken care of by at least March 31st, 2011. He's forced to give this tenant a big credit of about $7,300. The $7,300 is applied to all the months that came before. This $7,300 is applied to all the months that came before, to all these months where he didn't apply it. This is about $2,000 worth. This tax credit is applied to this $1,000 or so that he took away for all these, for the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 credits that he gave her, and then payments that he gave her, and then he took it away. So now we're putting this back, and the $7,300 is applied retroactively to February 2010. It's applied to all the months that he didn't give her to her. He claims that she did not renew her eligibility in this program in 2008 and 2009, but finally by March of 2011, he claims that she was eligible, and this is the amount that should have been applied. Okay, so this credit right here not only applies to all the months that came before, but it's applied retroactively to this February 2010 rent demand, which the tenant paid in full, and that's her receipt from her checkbook, check 135. Okay, so by the end of March 2011, the landlord has the full payment for that February 2010 rent, and he's got a tax credit, so that's an overpayment. So in order to make the tenant whole, the landlord can either give money back to the tenant, or the tenant can refuse to pay rent until she spends down the overcharge, which is what she's done. But the landlord doesn't like that. So what the landlord has decided to do is we've created a false court record. Anybody who has any sense of what's going on is being kept away. We have a nice false court record, and I'm going to give you examples of that in another video. And what the landlord has done is he's called Adult Protective Services, and his staff, Natasha Phillips, is the bookkeeper. I challenged Natasha Phillips, and in a retaliatory manner, she sicked Adult Protective Services on this little old lady. Adult Protective Services sent down a psychiatrist in about November December of last year. The psychiatrist found this little old lady competent. But the landlord doesn't like that, because if this little old lady is competent, then Adult Protective Services can't take her case. So they mailed her a letter that said she was found competent, and now they say that's an administrative error. The psychiatrist is changing his story. She's really incompetent, and now Adult Protective Services can take her case and access a one-time cash emergency grant for so-called back rent. But there is no back rent. The landlord lied. His attorneys lied. And they're bamboozling this little old lady. So let's listen to a tape-recorded conversation with Adult Protective Services that shows they have no plausible deniability. And I'm going to listen with you.
Good morning, Adult Protective Services. Miss Felix speaking. How can I help you?
Miss Felix, it's Lydia Radin. I'm going to put,
Hold on 1 second, Miss Radin.
Betty?
I'm here.
Okay. I went to Adult Protective Services. Jasmine Smith.
Radin, yes, how can I help you?
Yes, Miss Felix?
Yes, hi.
Okay. Miss Felix, Betty Povanetti, you on the phone with me?
I'm on the phone.
Hello, yes, hi. How can I help you this morning?
Okay. Miss Felix, Miss Povanetti has been declared incompetent, and her attorney, Patrick Mark, claims that when you sent out a letter to her last year that she was competent, that was an administrative error. Now, Betty, do you know have you ever seen the psychiatric report, Betty?
Never, huh?
Okay, I've never seen it. I suspect I'm being defamed. I suspect she's being defamed. We have a right to see a psychiatric report that's defaming us, and we certainly have a right to see a psychiatric report that's declaring Betty is incompetent. So basically, Natasha Phillips from the landlord called up Adult Protective Services. They sent a psychiatrist down. He found Betty competent. He sent a letter. That didn't serve the landlord's interests. So now Adult Protective Services is changing their story, and now they've claimed that there was an in court, Betty's court-appointed guardian, Michael Valentine, claims there was an administrative error. Now, Betty has a right to know Betty and her family and her church have the right to. Betty, do you know the name of the psychiatrist? Did he tell you his name?
No, I don't know his name. And I was right up there with him. I never heard that mentioned.
Do you have his card so you can report him to his licensing board?
I'm sure I have his card somewhere.
Well, hello, Miss Felix? Hello?
I think she hung up.
All right, we'll call her back. Stay on. Hold on. Miss Felix?
Yeah, they're all in cahoots. That's why they hang up.
Yeah. Betty, hang up for a minute. I'm going to call him back, okay?
Good morning, Adult Protective Services. Miss Felix speaking. How can I help you?
Miss Felix, did you hang up on us?
I put you in hold. You were kind of talking, but you didn't hear it, and I said, hold on. I had another call. So how can I help you?
Okay. Betty, are you there? Hello?
I'm here.
Is this Miss Dampier? I'm sorry, is this Miss Felix?
Yeah.
Am I on speakerphone?
Yes.
Good, I want to be on speakerphone. Who else is there?
No one else?
Okay. Apparently, what happened was Natasha Phillips, who is the bookkeeper for the landlord and who I challenged on the rent, called Adult Protective Services last year. Hello?
I'm here.
Okay. Betty, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, Betty Povanetti is on the phone. Betty, do I have your permission to speak?
Yes, you do.
Okay. So, apparently, when we were challenging the overpayment last year, Natasha Phillips, who's the bookkeeper for the landlord, called Adult Protective Services and sicked them on Miss Povanetti. They sent a psychiatrist down. The psychiatrist found her competent. Now we're in court, and Betty's court-appointed guardian/attorney, Michael Valentine, claims that Adult Protective Services is changing their story and that there was an administrative error made when the letter was sent to Betty saying that she was found competent. Now she's been found incompetent. Betty, have you ever seen the psychiatric report?
No, not at all.
Okay, we've never seen the psychiatric report. I suspect it involves me. I'm being stalked by my medical school. There's a dishonest psychiatrist named Jimmy David who runs around behind my back telling horrible lies about me.
We both have good lawsuits on our hands.
Okay, Betty, we're not but Betty,
I'm here.
I'm trying to get the cooperation of these people, okay? Are you still there, Miss Felix?
Yeah.
Okay. We're not threatening lawsuits. What we want to see is the psychiatric report, and Betty wants to know the identity of her the psychiatrist that Adult Protective Services sent down so she can report him to his licensing board. Now, this is the criminal scheme.
Did you speak to Ms. Felder about that?
Pardon me?
Did you speak to Ms. Venetia Felder about getting the name of the psychiatrist?
I can't get a hold of Miss Felder. Miss Jasmine Smith refuses to speak with me. In fact, I came down to Adult Protective Services and tried to ask a single question of Jasmine Smith and Miss Sherry Dampier. And I said, listen, I have one quick question. Betty Povanetti paid the February 2010 rent in full. And then about a year later, she got credit from SCREE. SCREE was applied retroactively, so for that February 2010 rent payment, the landlord collected a full amount from Betty plus the SCREE, which demonstrates an overpayment. This is one example of an irrefutable overpayment. Now, instead of addressing this issue, Jasmine Smith and Miss Sherry Dampier ran away because they said they were afraid I was going to tape record them and put them up on YouTube. I'm like, what are you guys doing that nobody should know about? If you're doing everything in an above-board fashion and you're not trying to bamboozle anybody, then why can't you answer this question? In fact, Miss Felix, I'd like Mr. Ronald Marshall to answer this question. I'd like you to answer this question. Betty presented in court. She handed it to the judge. Here's the February 2010 rent demand. Here's my check receipt from my checkbook, and it's dated check number 135, where I paid this rent demand in full.
Which was a huge sum.
Well, it wasn't huge. It was February 18th, 2010, with respect, Betty. It was the date on the check, I think, is February 18th, 2010. You were paying for January and February, and you paid about $1,300. I think it's $1,344.72. And part of that $1,300 payment was the February rent demand in full, which I believe was $669 because your rent increased a little bit later on. But she pays the February rent in full. And then about a year or so later, in 2011, March 31st, 2011, Betty gets a huge credit from SCREE of about $7,300. That SCREE payment was applied retroactively, and so for that month, February 2010, Betty paid the rent in full, $669.
Hold on, okay? I have another caller. Just hold on.
Hello? Betty?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, Betty. When the psychiatrist declares you incompetent, they're not supposed to do it behind your back. You're supposed to see that psychiatrist report. You're supposed to be able to challenge that report, and you should be able to turn this guy into his licensing board if he's lying about you.
Well, I have a good lawsuit on my
Betty,
hands.
don't threaten lawsuits, okay? You're going to scare these people, all right?
Oh.
What they're doing is they're running a criminal scheme. You caught them.
So then what do I tell them? Huh?
Well, right now you're going to give them the opportunity to do the right thing, and if they don't, then you're going to go down and talk. Then we're going to deal with it.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Anthony Borowski at the District Attorney Action Center works in a tag team with Miss Sherry Dampier. I went down and tried to talk to Miss Sherry Dampier. She ran away. Okay. Because you know what they said? We're afraid. We're afraid you're going to tape record us and put us up on YouTube and that everybody will know. Know what?
But you know, I have never received a letter saying that I was incompetent.
No, you got a letter saying you were competent, and I gave that, and everybody has a copy of that letter. Brother Tapia has a copy of that letter.
But now if they're if they're reversing that decision, how come they didn't send me a letter stating that? Huh?
That's the criminal scheme they're running behind your back, because nobody cares about whether you're competent or not. What they're trying to do is the landlord is trying to get Adult Protective Services to take your case. The only way Adult Protective Services can take your case.
So in other words, what they did, of course, and not sending me a letter stating that they've reversed the decision.
They didn't reverse the decision, Betty. They didn't reverse the decision. It's a criminal scheme. They're contradicting themselves. Okay. The gatekeeper is the psychiatrist. Let me finish. You are just a pawn in a criminal scheme. The only way that there's a gatekeeping method here. The only way that Adult Protective Services can take your case is if you're found to be incompetent, and there's some other criteria.
And that's what they're trying to do.
Miss Raiden, you there?
Yeah.
Go ahead, I'm listening.
So I can't get a call back from Jasmine Smith. When I went down to talk to Jasmine Smith, both she and Sherry Dampier ran away. We're afraid you're going to tape us and put us up on YouTube. What are you afraid of? If you're telling the truth and you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't be afraid of doing anything in an above-board fashion and let everybody see. Instead, the landlord has his staff call Adult Protective Services. Adult Protective Services sent a psychiatrist down. The psychiatrist found Betty competent, but that isn't good now, you see, because the landlord doesn't want that. The landlord wants to get his hands on money. So what the landlord wants is to have Betty declared incompetent and have Adult Protective Services take her case. That way he can access a one-time cash emergency grant. There's no emergency, and Betty doesn't owe any back rent that this cash emergency grant would pay. So this is a criminal scheme to steal money, and Betty's the schnook in the process who's being declared incompetent. We don't know we don't know the name of the psychiatrist. Does he have a business card? What's his name? We've never seen the psychiatrist report. Her own attorney, privately paid attorney, was busy keeping the landlord's motions away from her, so she, for example, so that she couldn't see how the landlord was lying in court. Betty, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but I went down and filed a claim for you with the U.S. attorneys, and I got the U.S. attorneys in Brooklyn saying, that's ridiculous. You didn't give up your right to make a counterclaim just because you signed a lease, but that's what the landlord's attorneys say. You didn't give up your right to a jury trial just because you signed a lease, but that's what the landlord's attorney said. So what you guys did is you have a psychiatrist who's operating behind Betty's back. She has a right to see that psychiatrist report. She has a right to challenge it. She has a right to turn this guy into his licensing board. Are you still with me, ma'am?
Yeah. I'm listening.
Okay. Here. This is what they did to me in Jersey. In Jersey, the corrupt judge with the dishonest landlord and his dishonest attorney went behind my back, got some idiot, told a pack of lies, forced contact with a so-called mental health professional. That mental health person named Stacy Dix-Kubiowski intentionally falsified, lied, made up reports. By law, she was supposed to give them to me promptly so I could challenge them. And this is happening on September 12th, 2008. Had this woman, Stacy Dix-Kubiowski, the hospital she was associated with, given those reports to me promptly, I would have challenged all the lies that she wrote deliberately, and I never would have been physically assaulted later on September 30th, 2008, and almost murdered. Because these so-called mental health professionals operate behind your back, that's how I almost got murdered. And now the same thing is happening to Betty.
Yeah, no one that ever spoke to me in court declared to me that they were a psychiatrist.
You didn't talk to anybody in court. This is what happened the last time we were in court, Betty. The Judge Lay, refused to recognize me as a friend of the court 3 times. I asked in writing, your brother asked, you asked.
Of course, you know all the complete case, all the evidence, and they don't want you up there.
Exactly. So when we were in court last time, the judge claimed that she wouldn't recognize me because I wasn't a party to the case. I didn't ask to be a party to the case. I didn't ask for standing. I asked to be recognized as a friend of the court. Judge Lydia C. Lay, L-I-A, has made false statements on the records for the last 3 times we were in court. That's a criminal scheme. She claims she can't recognize me because I have no standing. I didn't ask for standing. Standing means you want to be a party to the action, like a plaintiff or a defendant. I didn't ask to be a party to the action. I asked for friend of the court status because when the judge asks questions and Betty needs some assistance, I can hand it to her. Betty, did you ask the judge to recognize me as a friend of the court?
Definitely, yeah.
Okay, so last time we were in court, her court-appointed guardian, Michael Valentine, is part of a criminal scheme to defraud the taxpayer and defame Betty as incompetent. And I handed to Betty the rent demand for February that contained the February 2010 rent demand for the entire legal regulated rent of $696, and on that same piece of paper was the checkbook receipt for check 135 that shows Betty paid it in full. But it was handed to the judge. The judge had it in her hands. And on that invoice, was written also Gilbert Polinsky's handwriting to show that Gilbert Polinsky knows what's going on. So when I went to see Jasmine Smith and Sherry Dampier on Wednesday, May 2nd, I asked them a single question. Okay, Betty paid the February 2010 rent demand in full. And then about a year later, her account was credited with SCREE, the Senior Citizens Discount. That was on March 31st, 2011. That SCREE discount was applied retroactively. So if she's getting a big SCREE discount in 2011 and it's applied retroactively to the February 2010 rent demand, that means the landlord got all of Betty's money because she paid it in full. Then he got an additional payment from SCREE of then he got an additional of about. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
So her SCREE discount in 2011 is applied retroactively. So in February of 2010, the landlord is holding in his hand all the money that Betty paid because she paid in full, plus he gets about $253 from SCREE, so that's an overpayment. Is that hard for you to understand? Miss Felix?
I'm here, I'm listening.
Okay. Betty overpaid. Do you understand that?
I'm listening to what you're saying.
Yeah, I didn't ask you if you were listening. I asked you if you understood what I just told you.
What do you think?
I don't know, ma'am. Could you say the words? Yes, I understand.
Well, I'm just listening. I'm basically the secretary here, Ms. Radin.
Mm-hmm.
And every time you call, you say the same thing. I make sure I send these messages to the director, the deputies, the supervisors. Mm-hmm. And I'm just listening. I mean, I don't know anything about the case. I can't say I agree with you because I don't know the case. I don't know anything what's going on with the case. I'm just listening, and that's my job. I'm listening. I'll take the message and I'll make sure I just relay the message.
Okay, so where's Miss Anderson?
She's actually here, but she's in a meeting at the moment.
Okay, it's your job to communicate to Miss Anderson
mm-hmm.
that that Betty Povin, that there's a criminal scheme being executed in court. And apparently she's being defamed as incompetent. She's never seen the psychiatrist report. I'd be interested in seeing that psychiatrist report, too. You know why, Miss Felix? Because I'm being stalked through life by a dishonest psychiatrist named Jimmy David who lies about me. Jimmy David is from my medical school, and I caught them in criminal schemes and refused to sign a contract releasing them from liability in my case. So here's how this dishonest psychiatrist operates. He runs around telling lies behind my back. That's what's happened to Benny. That's what happened to me in Jersey City. That's how I almost got murdered. So how come your organization, how come Miss Anderson can't provide Betty, her family, and her church with the identity of the psychiatrist and the psychiatric report?
I've never received such a report that I was incompetent.
They changed their mind, Betty, because if they declare you incompetent, then the landlord can access, Adult Protective Services will take your case, and the landlord can access a one-time cash emergency grant to pay so-called back rent. But you don't owe back rent. You overpaid, and they don't want to acknowledge the facts because then the landlord's going to be held accountable for swindling a little old lady. And guess who's helping swindle the little old lady? Anthony Borowski at the district attorney's office. Because I went to him before I went to Adult Protective Services, and I asked him about this. I confronted Mr. Anthony Borowski. He gave me the bum's rush so fast he couldn't get me out of his office fast enough. Mr. Borowski, here's the rent demand for February 2010. Here's the check receipt, check 135, where Betty paid this rent demand in full.
Wasn't it about $5,000?
No, this is the check for the $1,300.
Oh.
So you paid the February 2000 rent in full, and then about a year later, you got a credit from SCREE that was applied retroactively. So for February of 2010, the landlord is holding your payment in full, plus he got an extra benefit of SCREE of $253. That shows an overpayment. That's one example, easy to understand. But Mr. Borowski doesn't want to deal with it. Are you still there, Miss Felix?
Uh-huh.
Well, guess what? Investigator Harmon refuses to return phone calls. Investigator Harmon is over at the Inspector General's office that's supposed to be investigating this case, but she doesn't return phone calls. So what we have here is a criminal scheme where Adult Protective Services is using a psychiatrist to declare Betty incompetent, and we don't have the name of the psychiatrist, she doesn't have the report, and all this is being done behind her back by her lawyers. Patrick Mark, who she fired. How come Mr. Patrick Mark never showed you the psychiatrist report? He wouldn't let us see the motions that the court was making, that the opposing counsel was making. He wouldn't let us see his reply. Everything's being done behind your back so they can create nice false records and bamboozle you and commit crimes. If they're not doing anything wrong, Betty, how come you don't know? You have a right to see the psychiatrist report. You have a right to challenge it. You have a right to turn that psychiatrist into his licensing board. This is what they did to me in Jersey and almost got me murdered.
Well, this is going to be my retaliation.
You're not retaliating against
I know. Well, I'm seeking justice, huh?
You're not retaliating against anyone. What these people are doing is wrong. So, Miss Felix, when you go along with this and pretend, oh, I just did my job and I just shuffled the messages around, it's not. No, Miss Felix, I would respectfully suggest you contact the district attorney's office immediately to protect your own self. And you get Miss Anderson to call me back, and you get Mr. Ronald Marshall to call me back. Because making up excuses so you can go along to get along, this is how the culture of corruption goes along. Hello?
I'm here.
Do I have to remind you? This is how these are the excuses that Nazi Germany made. Oh, I'm just following orders. I'm not responsible. I just put the people on the trains. I don't know where the trains are going. Oh, I just put the poison in the bucket. I didn't know people were going to die. I was just following orders. I was just doing my job. I'm telling you right now, Ms. Felix, that what's happening here is wrong. It's criminal. Jasmine Smith has a responsibility to call me back. Miss Sherry Dampier has a responsibility to call me back. Miss Felder has a responsibility to call me back. Mr. Ronald Marshall has a responsibility, and Miss Anderson has a responsibility to call me back. If they're doing nothing wrong, then they have no problem with me and Betty Povanetti taking steps to protect ourselves. I've already been threatened. Those threats have already been acted on. I have every right to do everything I have to do to protect myself against a bunch of criminals who almost murdered me.
Hello?
Hello?
I'm here.
Okay, so what's your excuse now, Miss Felix?
I'm just listening.
You're just listening. Do you understand that Betty made an overpayment in February 2010? Yes or no?
Told me.
I didn't ask you whether you heard me or whether I told you. I asked you whether you understood. Why are you dodging that question?
Well, I mean, it's like I can't verify that. I'm going by what you're telling me.
Oh, yes, ma'am, you can. And in fact, I sent...
Wasn't that the one for $5,000?
No, Betty, that was a different check.
Oh.
That was the check where you paid. That was a different check that you paid. Yes, you can. And actually, Miss Anderson, Mr. Marshall, Miss Smith, Miss Felder, Miss Dampier all have on email scanned the document that I'm talking about, and I can send it to you on email, and you can look at it. You've got the February rent demand for $600. Well, I don't have to get into those details, but you have the February rent demand, and you have a check receipt that shows from Betty's checkbook that shows she paid that rent demand in full. And then they also have the landlord's ledger sheet where he credits her about $7,300 about a year later that was applied retroactively to that month. So that means for that month, the landlord not only collected scree, but he also collected payment in full from Betty, and that shows irrefutably the overcharge. Your office already has that information. If you'll give me your email address, I'll send it to you. Or
No, that's fine.
Or you could ask Jasmine Smith, or you could ask...
I'm not a caseworker. I'm not a supervisor.
Okay,
I'm
making up
I'm not a deputy.
Okay, making up excuses so that you can go along with criminal conduct doesn't absolve you from the criminal conduct, Miss Felix. Okay, making up excuses for these people not calling back, making up twisted little stories like, oh, we're afraid. You're not afraid. That's just a propaganda technique. So where is Miss Anderson now?
She's actually in the meeting at the moment.
When will she be done with her meeting?
I don't know.
Where's Mr. Ronald Marshall now?
He's in the meeting as well.
Okay, when will he be done?
I don't know.
Where's Mr. Liburg?
He had to leave the office
When will he be coming back?
in the afternoon.
Okay, I'd like any one of these three people to call me back. Where is Jasmine Smith?
I don't know.
Okay, where's Sherry Dampier?
I do not know that either.
Where's Miss Felder?
I don't know that either.
Okay, well then since you don't know and we can't locate them, let's go to Miss Anderson, Mr. Marshall, or Mr. Liburg. Please have one of those people call me back.
Okay, I'll make sure they get your message.
No, ma'am, this is not make sure I get the message. This is they need to call me back because your organization is involved in criminal conduct. Betty Povanetti, if she's being declared incompetent, which is defaming to her, then she has a right to see the psychiatrist report. If I'm mentioned, I have a right to see that psychiatrist. And I believe I'm being referred to as an outside, a pernicious outside influence. I have a right to know who this psychiatrist is. I've never spoken to any mental health professional associated with your organization. We have a right. I want to see that report. If I'm mentioned, I want to know the name of that psychiatrist. We have a right to see the report. We have a right to challenge the report. And you know something, Betty? I think we may want to publish that report all over the internet so everybody
Lydia, my older brother works for the Daily News, a high position, a top photo engraver. This would be a very good story for the Daily News to have on their front page.
Okay. So why don't we avoid all that and have Miss Anderson call me back, or Mr. Ronald Marshall call me back, or Mr. Liburg call me back, so that we don't defame a little old lady and help steal money from taxpayers. Okay? Would that be good, Miss Felix?
I'll make sure they get the message.
Okay. Do you have any? Do you love this, Betty?
Yeah, well, it's almost as if we're living in Russia, not in the good old USA, you know, that all this is going on, huh?
Okay.
How this landlord of mine can get away with us, is getting away with all this is just unbelievable, huh?
All right. So right now, you've got evidence of criminal conduct in court. Right now, Judge Lydia C. Lay is lying on the record, refusing to recognize me as friend of the court status,
of course they don't want you around because you know what's going on. You know the scheme, huh?
So instead of recognize me as friend of the court status, she makes up stories about standing. Once again, I didn't ask for standing. And we've got Betty's court-appointed guardian, Michael Valentine, who's going along with this scheme. He says he calls Adult Protective Services. Adult Protective Services made an administrative error. And now Betty's incompetent, and now they're trying to access money in a one-time cash emergency grant. So if that's true, if the psychiatrist involved wants to contradict himself, we want to know who he is, we want to see the psychiatrist report, and we want to know why all of this was done behind our backs and we were kept in the dark.
Yeah, how come I didn't receive a report that I was declared incompetent?
You got that, Miss Felix?
I'm listening.
Okay, I didn't ask you if you were listening.
I'm listening.
All right, put me through to Miss Anderson, please.
I'll make sure she gets the message.
Put me through to her voicemail, please.
I'll make sure she gets the message.
Put me through to her voicemail, please.
Even if you leave a message on her voicemail, I'm going to retrieve the message.
So you're the gatekeeper who could stop Miss Anderson from getting her messages if you wanted to cooperate in this criminal scheme. Is that correct? Miss Felix?
I'm here.
If you retrieve Miss Anderson's messages, and then you could put a stop to any messages you decided you didn't want Miss Anderson to hear. Is that correct?
I'm listening.
Theoretically, that could happen. Is that correct?
I'm listening.
I didn't ask you if you were listening. You just stated that if I left a message on Miss Anderson's voicemail, you retrieve the messages. So that means that you could control the flow of information to Miss Anderson, and she could never get any voicemail messages that I left.
I think she's not getting a lot of messages from what's going on.
It sounds like you're pretty competent there, Betty.
Yeah.
So, Miss Felix, would you ever...
You don't have to be a lawyer to figure this thing out. It's common sense.
Thank you, Betty. So Miss Felix, is Miss Anderson getting her messages, or are you stopping messages from getting to Miss Anderson?
She's getting the messages.
Okay, so she's deliberately ignoring them?
I don't know.
Well, then you can put me through to her voicemail, please.
All right, what I'm going to do, I'm going to hang up.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to call again, and you're going to leave your message, okay?
Okay,
I'm going to hang up, call her number, which is 722-4830, and you can leave the message.
So it's 718-722-4830. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Hello?
Should I hang up?
No, wait, let's see if I can get through.
Oh, okay.